Preet Bharara knows a thing or two about the Department of Justice and our legal system. He served as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York for nearly 8 years, and he joins me now. So, Preet, I just wanted to start kind of with the overall point I was making there. I mean, you were a federal prosecutor under the last Democratic administration. Explain just how ridiculous these claims of a weaponized DOJ are, and by all means, if there's anything I missed, please add it in as well.
No, you were pretty comprehensive. Good to be with you. Look, it is perfectly legitimate for people to have arguments about and give their opinions about the nature of the evidence, the strength of the evidence, the rulings by the judge, whether or not there are appealable issues. But this grand flat earth, kind of society, conspiracy theorizing that goes on just stretches every bit of credulity a normal good faith person would have. I mean, the theory is, as you outlined at the start, is that Joe Biden, who's the commander-in-chief and president of the United States, has all this power that he's using to sort of be a puppeteer of someone who doesn't even work in the federal system. And Republicans once upon a time used to care about federalism and talk about federalism, that he is pulling the strings of Alvin Bragg to get him to bring the case, causing him to win the case. And this person who has all this power doesn't do anything about his own Justice Department, who today is bringing a case, as you pointed out, beginning a trial against his own son. And if there's one thing we know about Joe Biden, and people can have different views about whether they want to vote for him or not, I think it's the case that he loves his son more than he wants to hurt Donald Trump, his erstwhile and future political competitor. And, next time you have someone on the show who's a Republican, you should ask them, isn't it true that Joe Biden has the authority and power constitutionally to fire the special counsel? The answer would be yes. Mm-hmm. Isn't it true that Joe Biden has the power constitutionally to pardon in advance his son and spare him from this spectacle? He does. And he didn't do any of those things. And the idea that a person who's not exercising his authority to protect his son was otherwise somehow a puppeteer of a local prosecutor in Manhattan just borders on ludicrousness and absurdity.
Yeah, I just want to just touch on something you just said. I mean, David Weiss, I mentioned this in the opening, he kept him on. He did not have to do that. There were several other moments where he has not had to keep him in the job. He has done that. We don't know what will happen in the outcome of this case. And as you also just mentioned, Alvin Bragg and I did as well, but people should understand this doesn't work for Joe Biden, doesn't work for the department. He doesn't work that way. No. He doesn't direct them. I want to ask you, go ahead.
Even people in the even people in the Justice Department work at some remove from orders of the president. People may forget this. I was fired by President Trump, in part because I refused to speak to him back in March of 2017 because it's inappropriate for a sitting United States attorney who has jurisdiction over his company, his foundation, and all sorts of other things, to talk to him without being communicated with by the Attorney General of the United States. There's an independence of the Justice Department, which is triple or quadruple or infinite when you're talking about a local prosecutor who was elected by the people of Manhattan, not appointed by the President of the United States.
An important thing for people to know and understand. I mean, if DOJ officials came through the White House, I kind of moved in the other, not even the White House, in the street. I would move in the other way to kind of avoid them. Right. I want to ask you just about, I mean, you have dealt with juries, you've dealt with the totality of the judicial system. And I've been trying to highlight how dangerous it is, these attacks on so many people who are participating, including the everyday Americans, the jurors, none of whom have come out publicly yet, and I certainly hope they don't. But tell me a little bit about those who work in the legal system, how dangerous this is and concerning when you hear these type of attacks, not just from Trump, but from many of the enablers around him.
Yeah. No, it's terrible. Look, again, there's a legitimate place for good faith debate and criticism of judicial rulings and arguments made by the defense or the prosecution. Look, people on the left, I think legitimately, I'm one of them, in my podcast and elsewhere, criticize the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and talk about whether or not Sam Alito or Justice Clarence Thomas should recuse themselves from various matters. That's good and open and honest debate. And the people who have a problem with Judge Merchan not recusing himself, you can have that argument. The Court of Appeals will have the final word on that. But attacking jurors in our system, I think, is a bridge too far. As you pointed out, a prosecutor would have said, and I said on a number of occasions, because we didn't win every case we brought, and Alvin Bragg would have taken in stride an acquittal in this case. And I think the good and rational thing to have done was, you can fight in the Court of Appeals, you can say you disagree with the jurors' decisions, but we've created a climate, not we, not you and I, but Donald Trump and his supporters have created a climate in which it's acceptable to talk about doxing jurors and attacking jurors and putting their safety in jeopardy. It's an unusual thing in a white-collar case. It doesn't involve violence or the mob, that the jurors' identities were kept anonymous. That's a function of the landscape that has been created by Donald Trump and his supporters. It's not a good thing for America or for the judicial system.
That's an important thing for people to remember. I mean, there's a reason we don't know their names. I want to ask you about this ProPublica piece that just came out. I mean, it talks about Trump funneling money and benefits to witnesses in his cases, which seems to raise a lot of, including benefits from his campaign, extra bonuses. It raised a lot of red flags to me, but I want to know what you made of it.
Yeah, I don't know. It certainly doesn't ring hollow. It rings true. On a much more, I think, insidious level, Donald Trump has known to have interfered in cases before. He's known to have sent messages on social media and otherwise to witnesses who are going to be against him, either admonishing them not to be against him or suggesting that there was something good in it for them if they were going to be for him. So he's done that sort of thing before. The question of whether or not he's engaged in witness tampering has been raised before. I think there are a lot of interesting issues raised by the ProPublica article based on the timing of benefits given to folks. But it's a very, very difficult thing for a prosecutor to prove that there was jury tampering based on what's happened and reported so far. So I take a little bit of a moment to examine them further and see if there's other reporting about it and an investigation that follows. But it's troubling and not surprising.
Troubling, not surprising. More we need to know about it. The other thing I wanted to just ask you about is nearly every single Republican official in the country, or far too many, is taking the opportunity to attack this verdict and the rule of law. Yesterday on Meet the Press, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas appeared reluctant to even condemn, as we've been talking about, threats against jurors. So I just want to play that and we'll talk about it on the other side.
Since Thursday's verdict, there has been a spike in violent rhetoric online directed toward the jurors in particular, including calls to publish their addresses, physical attacks. Will you condemn those threats?
Well, Peter, I don't know what obscure websites that you've gone to.
Well, no, this is from Truth Social. It's not an obscure website. An individual says, I hope every juror is doxxed and they pay for what they have done. May God strike them dead. We will on November 5th and they will pay. You can condemn that threat, can't you?
Again, I will always say that violence has no place in our politics. Again, I don't know what obscure account you found on social media.
Well, it's on Truth Social. It's on his website.
That wasn't a hard or trick question, I think, from Peter, to condemn violence or threats against jurors. I'm just trying to wrap my head around, and so I'm asking you, what does it tell you that a sitting senator is so hesitant to condemn these type of calls for violence?
Well, I don't know. I can't put myself in the mind of a U.S. senator and that particular senator. But, if someone has an aspiration to be the vice president or a cabinet member or a member of the Supreme Court, all of which are not unviable prospects for someone like him and others, you don't want to get athwart, you want to get on the wrong side of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's rhetoric, I think, is the model here for everyone else who's talking about it. It's very performative. I think it's dangerous when we're talking about, separating out criticism, good faith criticism of the judge or the prosecutors or the defense lawyers from the jury. I've not seen that before. There are jury decisions that have been made in this country in consequential cases, including the O.J. Simpson case back, 30 years ago, that people disagree with. And I don't remember people talking about or seeming to accept the idea of violence against those jurors. This is something that we haven't seen that much of before, and I think it's dangerous and it's improper.
Preet Bharara, thank you as always. Thank you for joining me this evening. I appreciate you taking the time. I want to bring in Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. Governor Pritzker, thank you so much for taking the time. And I really enjoyed our conversation back then. I was reflecting on it today as we were preparing for this interview. So when I spoke with you a few months ago, you said, which is so reasonable and it stuck with me, you hoped Republicans would start calling Trump out on his dangerous rhetoric. Instead, many are now amplifying his attacks on our justice system, especially in the last couple of days. This might not surprise you, but what is your message to all of them now in this moment?
Well, they should begin by renouncing the violence and the jailing that President Trump is calling for. You've heard a lot of his supporters, Laura Loomer and others, congressmen from Georgia, calling for either the death penalty or jailing of people who don't support Donald Trump. And it is divisive. What they are doing is now taking sides with Donald Trump. That is the part that I think is un-American. This idea that we're going to have a country where you can no longer speak out with your views as a Democrat or even as a Republican. And I know many are afraid, as I said months ago. But the idea that now you're going to be threatened with violence, that's a challenge that I think the American public is going to stand up to. And in fact, it's going to call to Americans who really want a country where you're allowed to stand up and vote as you want, to say as you wish in the political arena. Standing against that, being for violence, that's un-American.
Absolutely. I do want to play something to this point that Marjorie Taylor Greene said earlier today and get your reaction on the other side of that.
We're literally a banana republic. So what does it matter funding the government? The American people don't give a
I mean, she's essentially, the context of her comments is she's basically saying we should shut down the government over a guilty verdict. And this is an attack on the system, an attack on our rule of law. I know it's happening here in Washington. You're not in Washington, but I just felt the need to call it out.
Well, the American people have a choice to make. It's clear. There's a president in office who's trying to truly make progress. And, there's a convicted felon running against him who's trying to make bail. And these are choices that Americans are going to have in November. I think the campaign from now until November needs to be a reminder of who these two people are, and particularly that Donald Trump, a convicted felon, an adjudicated rapist, is a serious contender for the presidency. I think that's going to be rejected by a majority of voters.
So one of the points the campaign has made is that, Trump obviously is a convicted felon. He will be a convicted felon. He's been convicted of these crimes. It's not going to be central to their message. I'm a believer they need to connect whatever they do to how things are going to impact the American people. I think you are as well. Talk to me about how much of the message you think that should be. It is a historic moment in a dark way. And what percentage should be about other issues that people are thinking about out there in their homes?
Look, this is going to be decided in November at the ballot box. And I think what's going to drive people to make their decision is what the stands are by the two candidates. So let's talk about that. Because, although before Donald Trump's name come the words convicted felon and adjudicated rapist, the fact is that Joe Biden needs to remind people that he's the only candidate running who's going to preserve our freedoms. Let's talk about reproductive rights. Let's talk about workers' rights and voting rights and civil rights. That is what Joe Biden has been fighting for his entire career and as president of the United States. Who's on the other side? This is a guy who literally sent jobs overseas while he was president. He rejected science. And the result of that is that hundreds of thousands more people died than should have in the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a former president who is a racist. He's a misogynist, a homophobe, a xenophobe. This is a person that does not represent the values of American families and the American people. I think we've got to make that very clear from now until November.
One of the issues you and I have talked about is abortion rights, and you have been incredibly outspoken on abortion rights. For the totality of the time, everybody's been fighting against Dobbs being overturned. 20% of people in the recent New York Times poll blame Joe Biden for Dobbs being overturned, which bends the mind. But I'm just asking you, how does the president and how does the party convince the public, the people who think that that's not true and not the case?
It's messaging over and over and over again, just reminding people that it's clear what the choices are. I mean, Donald Trump keeps saying that not only is he opposed to abortion rights, he's also opposed to contraception. He's also opposed to IVF. I mean, this is somebody who I think most Americans would say is out of touch with modern American society. Women should have the right to make decisions for themselves about their own futures. And this is about their economic futures. This is about the future of their families. And we're not just talking about, a poor single woman who may want to get an abortion. That is something that happens, and we want to make that available. But also about families and spouses who are making decisions about the futures of their family. They may have children now. They may be trying to have more children with IVF. Donald Trump wants to cut all that off. And, we got a hint of this extension of the anti-abortion movement in the decision that was written by current Justice Clarence Thomas when he talked about going after contraception, going after LGBTQ rights, going after IVF. So we knew this was coming. Now we have a presidential candidate who used to be president who's proven that he believes in that philosophy. He appointed the 3 Supreme Court justices who put Dobbs in place. And we know what the future of women's rights are going to be as a result of a Donald Trump second presidency.
Before I let you go, Governor, I know a lot of Democrats out there watching are looking forward to the convention and all the speeches. There are a lot of concerns expressed about potential for protests, potential for violence from protests. I mean, hopefully not, of course. Can you tell me a little bit more about the preparations happening in Chicago and how concerned you are about that?
Well, let's remind ourselves that the last convention that was in Chicago was in 1996. It was a phenomenal convention. I think I've been to every single convention since I was able to vote. And that 96 convention in Chicago, the last one here, was the best, if you ask me. Now, the convention we're about to put on, even better, because first of all, we're going to show off the values and the diversity of the Democratic Party, also the tremendous amazing kinds of advancements that have been made because of Joe Biden and his policies. And let's point out that they were bipartisan bills that allowed us to build infrastructure, to invest in the CHIPS and Science Act, to bring climate change policies that are good for the American people. That's all going to be on display at our convention. In terms of safety in the city, we've got every level of law enforcement, from the Secret Service and the FBI all the way down to Illinois State Police, Chicago Police Department, even Milwaukee Police, and our sheriffs and sheriff deputies on duty to make sure that everybody has a safe and productive time and secure time while they're here in Chicago. And there will be protests. Let's be clear. We're going to stand up for the right to people to express their First Amendment rights. But we're also going to make sure that everybody has the ability to enjoy the city and to get to the convention safely. And I think the American people are going to get to see the best of the Democratic Party inside that convention hall.
Nowhere better almost than Chicago in the summer, I have to say. Governor J.B. Pritzker, thank you so much for taking the time this evening. Amy Walter, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Cook Political Report, joins me now. So a lot of what I've learned about double haters, I've learned from reading you and the things you write and listening to you talk. So let's just start with the basics. I mean, who are the double haters and what percentage of voters are they?
That's a good question. I think they mostly fall into they define themselves as independents. I talked to one pollster the other day who told me that in polling that he's done, up to 40% of independents say they dislike both candidates. So that's a significant, that's a significant
Is it
group of
bigger
people.
than normal?
Well, so overall, I think it's somewhere between, so in our swing state polling that we did about 2.5 weeks ago now, what we found is about 16% of voters can be in that category. I've seen polls that it's anywhere, especially the national polls, up to 25% of all voters. So it's a significant group. In 2016, it was somewhere between 13 and 14 overall, so a little bit more than in 2016. And we know what happened in 2016, right? That those voters at the very end broke disproportionately for Donald Trump. And I think part of the reason why, that's why I was going to, who the spotlight is on at the end matters more than anything. What were we talking about going into the weekend before the election? It was more emails. It was James Comey. It was, right, that spotlight.
Who the spotlight was on.
Exactly.
The other person
The
benefits.
other person. Usually in a campaign, you want your candidate in the spotlight going into the final days of the campaign. In this case, I think both of these candidates would be happy if the spotlight were on the other candidate and specifically on their liabilities.
A referendum on the other person, definitely, which is such an interesting thing. Let me ask you about the demographics. As I understand it, it's younger, more diverse.
Yep. They don't identify as much with the party. I mean, if you think about in your previous piece about black voters, I think you have a lot of black voters right now who are saying, I just don't really see a reason for me to vote for Joe Biden, right? That they are sitting right now in this sort of just uncomfortable place where they don't know if they're really going to vote, why they should vote for Biden. They're not necessarily over on the Trump camp. So you can put that then into that category. And many of these younger voters of color have felt disinclined to be part of this process for a long time because they don't feel like they have a place in our modern politics, that they haven't been inspired or excited, and that the voters that the candidates haven't been speaking directly to their issues.
So there's so many different issues that candidates, different parties want to talk about. Right. I mean, a lot of Democrats you talk to, they want to talk about abortion rights. You look at how the Biden campaign has spent money. The Trump team, well, sometimes they want to talk about his own legal issues. That's a whole other separate thing, but also about immigration and the border.
Yeah.
What do these voters want to hear about? What do they care most about? Do we know?
Well, it's interesting. We've been taking a deep dive into some of these voters who, they're not necessarily double haters, but they are undecided. At least we had a bigger sample of people who either are undecided or they're falling into third party. What's interesting is many of them, abortion is a very critical issue for them. Other group of voters where abortion's a critical issue are people who don't show up in every election. You probably know them as drop-off voters, people who are less inclined to show up in every single election. Abortion is a very important topic to them. Now, of course,
it might motivate them.
It might motivate them to actually come out and vote. I think that's why you're seeing so much of the advertising from the Biden campaign or the focus of the Biden campaign talking to those voters about this issue, because obviously the economy is the second. That's also something that they're very, very concerned about.
And on the economy, because that does pop. It just keeps popping as the number one issue, including in the recent Harvard poll among young people, which popped as kind of the number one issue among young people, voters under 29. What is the message that group? Is there a message that's clear they want to hear?
I don't know. I think the message is that they want things not to cost as much, especially when it comes to the cost of housing, when it comes to the cost of stuff. This was what we found in our polling that was the most problematic for the president is you ask people, what's your number one concern? The cost of living. Okay. Do you think the president has an ability to bring the cost of stuff down? Overwhelming majority said yes, the president can do something about this. Do you think Joe Biden can do that? No. Do you think Donald Trump can? Yes. Now, that is really, when it comes right down to it, the idea that things cost too much, the president can do more than he is doing, and he hasn't been able to follow through. Donald Trump would be able to do that. That's why this conversation about unemployment and infrastructure is not breaking through, not because people don't like those things, but because they want the cost of stuff to be less.